Hi, it's Alistair McIntyre at Electric Scotland. This is my introduction to my weekly newsletter for 9th of June 2017. I delayed this a bit. I mean, it's still going out on Friday, but usually I put it up usually early evening on a Thursday night. But this is now going out, I'm doing this about 10 a.m. on Friday morning, so it will still go out today. Essentially, I held it off because obviously the UK were having the elections yesterday, and I thought to myself it'd be a good idea just to hold it back a little so I could give you the results. I certainly will say that the bit unexpected, shall we say. I mean, it always looked like the Tories would get an overall majority. It was just a question of how big that majority would be. But to be honest, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, made a real hash of the elections. So much so that certainly the Tories are now in a minority position. And I think they could only form a government with the help of the DUP in Northern Ireland. But obviously we'll have to see what happens. In Scotland, the results were just amazing. Essentially, the SNP lost 21 seats, which is way more than they thought. And in fact, the party where they had before something almost about 50% of the popular vote, they're now down to 37%. So clearly Nicola Sturgeon can no longer claim that she has a mandate to go ahead with IndyRev 2. So again, it'll be interesting to see what she does on that front. But certainly I think it was good that we sent a signal to the SNP saying, look, you can't assume things anymore. You're going to have to do a better job of government if you really want to do things. And of course Alex Salmond and Angus Robertson, two very important SNP MPs, both lost their seats in this election. In fact, the leader of the Commons, Pete Wishart, he only actually won his constituency by something like 21 votes. I'm surprised there wasn't a recount there actually because it's that tight. But anyway, I think the signal's been sent that Scotland doesn't want a second IndyRef right now, and I think the SNP needs to get down to proper government. They really need to talk to the Scottish people, not just their supporters, and they need to fix their education and our health service, and start listening to people basically. So. In many respects, a very interesting election. I think very good for Scotland. What it's going to do to the rest of the UK, I have no idea right now, but obviously the days ahead will tell us. Okay, so we'll go ahead with what I'm covering in the news this week. Certainly, one of the interesting stories is about Buy a Street Name. This is Moray Council. Had decided that the way they could maybe raise some money is to allow people to buy a street name, essentially. So I'm not quite sure if there's a clan up there, but if there was a clan, it might have a clan whatever street. Corporates could have one. You as an individual could perhaps purchase one. They're not seeming to talk about a whole massive amount of money, but to buy a street name. But they do reserve the right to reject a name that you may want because if it's not appropriate, of course. But I thought that was rather interesting way. So you might like to read that article because it might give you some ideas for raising money in your own communities, wherever you are in the world, to sell a street name. So the next story I put up was, must confess, it was in praise of smoking. Came from the Scottish Review, and as probably most of you know, I'm a smoker, and if you count second-hand smoke, I've been a smoker for something like 66 years, so when I saw that I thought, oh, this is interesting. So, I don't know, you might be interested in reading that one. The next story is Submarine's Great Leader honoured in Port Patrick. This is the exploits of a Victoria Cross recipient, and obviously a Scottish one, and I just thought that was really interesting. I thought you might like to read that. There's also a nice wee story about Highland ponies in their element, so that could be an interesting one. An independent Scottish foreign policy. When I saw that, I thought that's good, because if Scotland ever does get independence, it's going to have to deal with the world. And frankly, apart from wanting to be in the EU, I've never really seen any discussion about what Scotland should need to do to engage with the world as an independent country. So I just thought to myself, that could be a really good article. So I hope you might like to read that one, because it does give us some background there. Then I got an email and it says 30 Years of Celtic Life. This is the Celtic Life magazine, comes from Nova Scotia, but it's celebrating its 30th year in print, and by all accounts it's a very successful publication. And they did a little video to celebrate, so I've given you a link to that video so you can watch it. Next one is Millionaire Stakes claim to be named head of Clan Buchanan. So, well, obviously if you're Clan Buchanan, you'll be interested in that story. So, I know. The eerie photographs of the abandoned island of Stroma. This is, Stroma used to have 375 people on it. Now there's no one living there at all. And obviously there's a lot of abandoned homes and everything there. So again, I thought to myself, that's an interesting story, so I included that for you to read. Scottish education, a generation failed. This is a Chocoblog post, and if you've been following along for a while, I'm basically highly complimentary about the Chocoblog. I think it's factual, and I think you can really trust what they're saying. And he's gone to quite some extent on analysing the performance of education in Scotland. And in particular, the Daily Record newspaper took his blog up and actually made a very large article in the Daily Record, more or less mirroring what he said but adding extra comments. So I thought you might like to read that, because it's factual. The other one is Jane Haining. She was a Scot who died at Auschwitz in obviously the Second World War. But here was a wee article about her being recalled by a former pupil of hers. Has the real Bonnie Prince Charlie's cave been found? Was another article. I wasn't actually aware that there was a problem with that, because I thought they knew where the cave was, but apparently not. So again, for clarity, I thought I'd put that article up for you to read. Scott's Piper on his desire to be the first to play in every country in the world. Again, I thought that was a good human interest story, so I hope you'll enjoy reading that. Saving Scotland from financial meltdown. It's a tightly argued and technically researched paper by the Scottish Research Society. So I thought to myself, well, yeah, I mean, if you're interested in Scotland and possibly independence, you need to read things like that. The Tyranny of Testing. This is an article again about Scottish education, but it's taken from the Scottish Review, and they are talking about whether this fixation on tests is really the best way to consider education. And I have some sympathy with that, but the trouble is testing is the only means we have really of knowing whether our pupils are being well served or not. So I still think we need testing, but this article is saying that it's more than testing for education. So again, I thought an interesting read. Ronnie Corbett basically stars Honor, the comedian, at a memorial service, and I think a lot of us know the two Ronnies. So Ronnie Corbett obviously was a very popular comedian, and this is a memorial, so I thought you might like to read that. And the final news story is Scottish universities slip down the global rankings. We've been talking about education, and we hadn't really talked about further education in universities, but it appears that universities are starting to suffer a bit now, so I thought we should at least be aware of that, so that's why I put that story in. And then on to Electric Canadian for this week. I've got the Great Furlands. These were sketches of life in the Hudson's Bay, and I thought that was, I mean, I've obviously read some of the stories there, and I enjoyed them, and I thought you might like to read that as well, so that's the book we put out. I also found the Encyclopedia of Canadian Biography, and it's got a very good index page, so if you've got Canadian roots, and you could look up the index, see if there's any of your name, and then read their biographies. So again, a useful resource. I've got an historical sketch of the Bank of Montreal, and again, if you read that article, you'll see there's tons of Scots that were involved in the forming of the bank, and it had a very successful, in fact it's a very successful bank, so it's well worth having a read. It was published in 1912, so obviously it's an historical treatise. Things worth doing and how to do them. This, as you know, I've been putting up the Baird collection of books. These are all ones where he's telling you how to light fires, build a shelter, all the survival stuff and everything. Well, I thought I'd got all of them up, but I found this one, which is mainly for girls. But I thought to myself, well, you know, now I found it, I'll put it up and add it to a collection. And finally, the Conrad Black, there's two stories this week. One is about détente on the horizon in Washington's war on Trump. The other one's the madness of the never-Trumpers. It's all falling apart for them. So these are the two his blog posts this week. And for Electric Scotland, I've continued working on the Forfar directory and yearbook. So I've got the one up for 1908. One of the wee stories from the collection is United Kingdom represented. Smith: good morning, Jones. I hear you have a son and heir. Jones says, yes, our household now represents the United Kingdom. Smith: how's that? Jones: why, you see, I am English, my wife's Irish, the nurse is Scotch, and the baby Wales. So I don't know, a bit of fun. Next one, Scotland in the Middle Ages. I've added 3 papers about topics to do with the Middle Ages. They're not very long, but I personally find them an interesting read, so I hope you do as well. Maybe the biggest one's about 30 pages, so they're not greatly long articles. Then terrorism in education as a counter to it. This is the video I did. It's just I've had some thoughts about the fact that the better educated we are, the more likely we are to be able to resist terrorism. Essentially, it's a question that I think in schools, for example, we should have religions of the world so that everyone knows what the core beliefs are of all the major religions. And I think that way we might get closer understanding, but as I believe it, I don't think we do cover religions of the world at school, but if we don't, we should. So that was just a wee video to try to illustrate the role of education there. Waters's Diary and Other Papers. This is a collection of papers on all kinds of topics. And again, it's one of those ones you can kind of dive into, scan it through, and if you like a story, read the whole thing. If you don't, just pass it over and read the next one. But certainly there's letters concerning Highland affairs in the 16th century by Mrs. Grant of Lagan. And I thought these were particularly interesting. So, but there's much more in there. There's talking about the honours of Scotland, and between 1661 and I think it was 1651 to 52. So that might be kind of interesting. The Scottish monasteries of old. This is a brief account of the houses which existed in Scotland before the Protestant Reformation. So again, if you're into history, that could be interesting. Cromwell's Scotch campaigns, that's 1650 to 51, and I put a link to that particular book from another book which gives you a bit of a history of that time period. So having read that, obviously Cromwell was a big player at that particular period in time, and so a book about his life, and I've also got this particular book about his Scotch campaign. So if you want to kind of build up more knowledge of that period, that's a good way of doing it. Then we've got a Robert Burns Lives article in. This is the Chevalier's Lament. It's a broadside and Robert Burns at the National Library of Scotland by Robert Betteridge. He's basically a curator for rare books and has a particular interest in Robert Burns at the National Library of Scotland. So he's an interesting character himself, and he's done a wee article about that topic, which again, I think it's this 255th article that's gone up in Robert Burns Lives. So if you're interested in Burns at all, there's just a phenomenal amount of information, and especially in Robert Burns Lives, it's all unique. There's nowhere else you can read that stuff, you know, it's just brilliant. And finally, the last book I dealt with this particular week was the Miscellany of the Maitland Club. I've had the Miscellany of the Spalding Club up on the side, but I didn't have the Miscellany of the Maitland Club, which is a similar organisation. So I've got volume 1 up, and I will bring you volume 2 next week and volume 3 the following week. What I've done is when you click on the link, you go to a page where I've scanned in a graphic of the contents page, so you can actually see what's covered within it. And if any of these are interested, just download the volume and then flick to the appropriate page and read the article you're interested in. These are usually books that I kind of dip into, look at the contents and say, oh, that looks interesting, I'll have a read at that. And then finally the story. Scottish Charms and Amulets. And this is about curing stones. And the reason I put this story out was I actually got a comment coming through the Discord system to say that the person had read one of these articles and was really fascinated and was asking some questions about it. So I thought, well, I'll put this one up because that kind of answers her question to some degree. So, and again, I thought you might be interested in that because obviously there was a time in our history where curing stones, people would travel miles to get use of those curing stones to fix illnesses and issues. So again, I hope you enjoy that one. And that's it for this week. So if you go below this video, you'll have a link to the actual newsletter, and obviously if you download that, you'll get the links to all these stories I've explained. And I hope you enjoy this issue, and obviously it'll be interesting to see how things go politically in the UK over the next week. Okay, thanks for listening.